The fog is lifting. Clarity is calling you forward. Welcome to Forward in Freedom. I'm Tanya Johnson. This is where awareness becomes power. Let's move forward in freedom.
What do you do when someone keeps crossing a boundary you've already explained? Not once, not accidentally, but repeatedly. How do you hold your ground without escalating conflict, without over explaining yourself, and without reopening decisions you've already made? That's what we're talking about today. And let's start with something important. People don't usually test your boundaries because they hate you. They test boundaries because they are trying to understand the structure of the relationship. In psychology and behavioral research, there's a very simple principle. People repeat behavior that produces results. If pushing a boundary once leads to an exception, it becomes a strategy, not a misunderstanding, a strategy. And this happens in workplaces, in families, in friendships, and in romantic relationships. Someone pushes, you explain. They push again, you explain again. Eventually, the conversation becomes about the explanation instead of the boundary. Boundaries don't fail because they were unclear, they fail when they keep moving. There's something called the over explaining trap. Most people believe the solution is better communication. If I explain it clearly enough, they'll understand. But here's the challenge. The moment a boundary requires a long explanation every time it comes up, it starts to lose authority because explanations invite negotiation. Consistency creates clarity. There was a season in my own life where I thought if I just explained myself well enough, people would respect my limits. What I eventually realized was this: respect does not grow from longer explanations, it grows from steadiness. Stop defending boundaries you already explained. When the pressure increases, here's something people don't expect. Sometimes when you hold a boundary calmly, the resistance increases. You might notice things like subtle guilt, coldness. You may even hear statements like, well, I guess I won't ask you for anything anymore, or you've changed. Research in workplace behavior shows that more than half of the people who introduce new boundaries experience pushback in the early stages. Not explosive pushbacks, subtle pushbacks, tone shifts, distance, energy changes. And that's the moment many people start retreating. Not because the boundary was wrong, but because the tension feels uncomfortable. But here's the truth: peace that requires self abandonment isn't peace, it's really appeasement. When your life changes, systems built around your sacrifice start shaking. So, now how do you respond without escalating? Holding a boundary does not require aggression. You don't need a speech. You don't need to win an argument. You simply reinforce the line. calmly. Examples can sound like this: I'm not adjusting that. I'm staying with what I said. That doesn't work for me. Short, neutral, consistent. Repetition teaches people the line is real. Emotion invites negotiation. Stop reopening settled decisions, because one of the most exhausting patterns people fall into is reopening decisions. You thought about it, you prayed about it, you processed it, and then someone pushes back. Suddenly, the entire conversation starts again. But every time a settled decision gets reopened, you send a message. The boundary might still be negotiable, and people learn quickly. You teach people how to treat you by what you keep renegotiating. Hmm. For people of faith, boundaries sometimes feel uncomfortable. We worry about appearing harsh, but compassion does not require unlimited access. Even Jesus stepped away from the crowds. He did not answer every accusation. He did not perform on demand. Grace and boundaries can exist at the same time. If God gave you clarity, you do not need universal approval to maintain it. Here's your freedom nugget for this week. A boundary becomes real the first time it survives pressure. Anyone can state a boundary, but the real test happens when someone challenges it. This week, notice the moments when you feel the urge to over explain. Pause, repeat the boundary once, then allow silence to hold the line. S- Silence often communicates strength more clearly than long explanations. I want you to take a moment to reflect on this question. Where in your life do you feel pressure to keep explaining something you've already made clear? Is it work, family, friendships? Now ask yourself this: is the issue confusion or testing? Because the way you respond changes depending on the answer. If someone is genuinely confused, clarity helps. You may need to explain the boundary once more so they understand what you meant. But if the issue is testing, more explanation usually doesn't help. For example, imagine you've told a coworker that you are no longer available for last-minute requests after a certain time in the evening. If they truly didn't realize that boundary mattered to you, explaining it again might solve the issue. But if they keep asking anyway, hoping you'll say yes just this once, then the situation is different. At that point, the response isn't more explanation, it's consistency. You simply say, I'm not available for that tonight, and leave it there. Awareness of that difference changes everything. Because once you recognize testing, you stop trying to convince someone to respect the boundary. and you start reinforcing the boundary itself. And that shift alone can bring a surprising amount of clarity and peace. Mm. If this episode helped you think about boundaries in a new way, I want to invite you to do two things. First, share this episode with someone who may be quietly struggling with the same issue. A lot of people feel exhausted defending boundaries they've already explained. Second, follow or subscribe to the podcast so these conversations continue to reach more people who are seeking clarity and healthier relationships. Every time you like, share, or comment on an episode, it helps the message reach someone who may truly need it. Next week, we're going to talk about something many people struggle with after setting boundaries. And I can't wait to share it. What happens when enforcing a boundary changes the relationship? When distance appears, when someone pulls away, or when the dynamic suddenly feels different. How do you know if the boundary strengthened the relationship or revealed something that was already there? That's where we're going next. I'm Tanya J, and this is the work of walking forward in freedom. Until we meet again, move forward in freedom.